joining us today for a lively discussion on how the challenges companies face in working with small and mid-sized business partners, vendors, and suppliers. Our speakers today from LexisNexis Risk Solutions are Etta Rochheit and Tom Hunt. Etta drives the commercial market strategy for business risk management. She has extensive experience in supply chain risk management, supplier information management, and global procurement. Tom helps clients find efficiencies in their commercial workflows via automated processes and more intelligent use of business information across the customer lifecycle. He's worked with financial institutions, card issuers, transportation, utilities, manufacturers, and wholesalers. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. For optimal audio experience, please use the flash option on your settings in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Please submit questions through the chat room. Etta and Tom will do their best to answer all questions. In the event that we run out of time, they will follow up with you via email. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. And now over to you, Etta.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you today. We're talking about due diligence on businesses and common challenges our customers face in managing that risk. So I will talk about challenges. Tom and I will kind of discuss what we hear from you, our customers, from the marketplace. And then afterwards, Tom will talk about tools and solutions that really can help you with those challenges. So let's get started. What are we hearing from our customers? So in talking to you and other existing customers and prospects as well, we really see the need and the trends driving the focus on third-party risk and due diligence. I'm sure you see it within your organization, right? So many of our customers do face those same challenges. And as I think most of you, all of you know, the famous question really is, what keeps you up at night? And so is it to avoid any surprises with your current supply base and partners? I assume, depending on your position in the company, that definitely keeps you awake. So are you sure you're doing everything to prevent any disruption in your supply chain? Is your business, your organization meeting all those compliance regulations? Right? We know there's increased scrutiny on all of us within our organizations by global regulators. So that global regulatory landscape has really undergone significant reforms and really enhanced due diligence requirements. So what we're thinking here, what we're hearing is really getting answers to these fundamental questions that are listed here, or some of these, and getting those answers to these questions will hopefully help you sleep better at night. But if you see the questions here, will your supplier deliver as expected? Are you stable? Is the business stable? Could the business impact, my brand negatively? Any impact on my company reputation? Are you actually real? Are you is it a fraudulent business, or are you a real business? And what about compliance issues? Is there anything out there that we should know about this company? So the next slide, what I worry about, and these kind of numbers and statistics are quite interesting, and that definitely I'm not the only one then lying awake and thinking about this and worrying about it. If you think 45% here name CPOs name the vendor threats as their biggest worry. And the second number here, the 87%, that's actually very interesting to me. We've done some other research 2 years before this where it was 73%, so it jumped to 87%. So 87% of organizations have faced disruptive incidents with third parties. So, Tom, I'm thinking, I look at these numbers and see something that keeps me awake. What do you think? What sticks out here for you?
Well, for me, from my perspective, I work a lot with clients in engaging those clients when they have reached out to LexisNexis to see, if we might if we might be able to help them, assess risk on third parties and vendors in particular. And it's interesting to me that the jump in the 87, from 73 to 87, because we have noticed an increase in those kinds of inbound calls to LexisNexis about how, what tools we might offer and those kinds of things. And very often, those conversations either begin with, there was a recent incident, there was a recent disruption that was concerning, and it raised the attention of some investigation, and usually at the end of that investigation, a lot of times our clients will tell us that, we probably could have anticipated this if we would have had the right information or would have just been asking the right questions. We maybe did that when we were onboarding this client, but then we just kind of evaluated their performance based on we wouldn't have known there was going to be anything wrong until there was something wrong, right? So it's interesting to me that we're seeing more and more of that, and I think our survey sort of bears that out as well.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, and that's kind of what also was interesting, and that kind of leads to what you were saying here, the 51% difficulty in monitoring third-party relationships. I'm actually surprised by that. And then 43% inconsistent reporting. But that's, as you're saying, that's kind of, it's after the fact people reach out. It's like, oh, there's an issue, and we definitely need some tools and some information here. We need data to kind of make some decisions and manage and mitigate risk. Yeah. Okay, so I hope you find those numbers interesting as well. And so really for the next slide, so it's no matter what industry, what kind of organization, what business you're in, it is really important to all of us to know who are you dealing with, who do you do business with, and how or why could these partners potentially put you at risk. So to help you manage and mitigate that risk, think about these questions that we're showing here. How can I effectively manage vendor risk? And Tom will talk more about risk ranking and kind of helping you kind of look at that. How can I maximize process efficiency? So as we, what are the tools, the solutions? Because there's a lot out there, and all of us face that increasing workload. And then really, how do you balance the compliance to the regulations, to even internal policies, anything like that, and the risk that is out there? So all very important questions. So the next slide, Tom, you have some insight here on risk rating. So go ahead.
Yeah. So typically when we begin to have these conversations with our clients about risk management around vendors in particular, we start to ask the questions around, how do you really risk rate these, the different vendors that you have? I mean, who you're buying staplers from would be a lot different than, and how you should manage that kind of vendor, how you treat that kind of vendor in terms of due diligence and risk assessment. It probably isn't a whole lot of risk, right? I mean, if it's an office supply thing, you can sort of, they're typically pretty easily replaced. But if we're talking about somebody that has access maybe to your IT infrastructure, or is a sole source provider of a critical element of what you do, that type of vendor could, requires a much more robust level of activity in terms of the work that we do when we're evaluating and monitoring and those kinds of things. And so what we typically see and what we work with our clients around are both strategic vendors as well as high-risk vendors. Now, these are not mutually exclusive categories. You can be strategic and high risk or strategic and low risk. But how we identify that, there's sort of a series of questions here that are on the screen that talk about, some essential ideas of how to identify who is a strategic vendor. So, having to do with, do they have access to your IT infrastructure? Do they have, if there was a sudden loss of their services, how would that impact your customers? Would time to restore service without this vendor be greater than 1 business day or greater than your organization's business continuity plan? So these are all sort of things to think about in terms of as we initially sort of begin to organize a strategic vendor versus a non-strategic vendor. The next thing that we'll do is we'll look at, well, who are the high-risk vendors? And so again, we see the access to the IT infrastructure, but also including personally identifiable information about your customers or your employees. We're all familiar with I think, stories in the news about IT vendors who have enabled compromises to internal data and things like that. And so those are folks that could be high risk. They may be easily replaced and those kinds of things, but if they have access to sensitive information. If they're a strategic provider that's single-sourced, are they a government-owned entity, or are they in a part of the world where there's, or in a particular industry? I mean, you hear, I frequently hear about, if we are working within an industry that is outside of the United States and they're pulling any kind of natural resources out of the ground, right? That makes them high risk. So that's kind of an example where we're talking about an industry or we're talking about a particular geography or location. Are there any politically exposed persons or any sanctions or any, is this a government-owned agency or anything like that? Or do they have any high-risk certifications that are required that need to be verified? And, those kinds of things as they, maybe handle different kinds of materials for you or need specific credentials for their particular environment. So once we have clients or vendors that are lined up within these particular areas, what we typically see and what we tend to work with our clients on is sort of the quadrant that you sort of see here, where there are high risk but not strategic versus low risk and strategic versus low risk and not strategic. So you can sort of see how we use the previous questions to kind of categorize different vendors within different groups. And the idea here is that we're going to try and mitigate or have the appropriate amount of friction to the onboarding and monitoring process. One size does not fit all. We're going to try and look at all of those vendors as appropriate based on the level of risk that they present. And so when we look at that, what are some of the activities that we typically see within these different quadrants, right? So starting at the bottom left, we might do a verification to make sure that it's a real business. Some basic screening. This is our low-risk, non-strategic vendors. We might do a little bit of fraud screening and those kinds of things. Check to make sure to see if they're on any sanctions or watch lists. These are all things that are pretty easily done. They're not very time-consuming. They don't add a lot of friction to the process. We're just sort of doing some initial screening and some initial due diligence. As we move to the right, we might add some additional. So now we're talking about a customer or a vendor that is they are high risk, but they're not strategic, and what that means is they can certainly present a risk to us in terms of maybe they're on a sanctions list, or maybe they're in a country that is has some corruption problems that we need to be aware of, or those kinds of things, but or maybe they would just be hard to replace and things like that. So maybe we take a little bit of a deeper look at those folks, right? We begin to look at credit risk assessment. We look at what's the history of any kind of derogatory public record searching. Is there any negative news or media available on them? That might also include, I sort of include in that, your Better Business Bureau searches and things of that nature as well. But are they making any noise sort of in those kinds of environments that create media? And also, we might also begin at this stage to look at what are the backgrounds of the people that are involved with running this business with some of the executives, particularly if maybe they popped up on one of those politically exposed persons as a government-owned agency or business or something along those lines. As we continue to move through that, then we have strategic but low risk. So there's certainly a thorough vetting of any sanctions, and PEP is an acronym for politically exposed persons. Certainly a thorough vetting of all of that. Understand any government connections, maybe do a country assessment if they're outside of the U.S. Close examination of any brokers that we might be working with from an anti-bribery and compliance perspective. We might need to understand or really take a close look at any of those external consultants. And this is the stage where we would verify any of those special certifications that they might need to have in order to help support us or work with some of our materials or what have you. And then finally, we've got the high risk and strategic vendors. And so now we're doing everything in these other three quadrants, plus we might also set up some negative news monitoring and some derogatory public record monitoring, and new executive monitoring, as well as credit and financial monitoring. So we've looked at that stuff in terms of any kind of onboarding, but in this quadrant, and maybe some in the orange quadrant here, we begin to do some monitoring, assuming that there are ongoing relationships there. So that obviously requires a lot of data. In order to sort of do that, there's a lot of different checks that we're sort of talking about there, and I'm going to sort of turn it back to Etta now to sort of talk about some of the data that we leverage to help answer some of those questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And definitely, interesting there when you talk about the strategic and highly strategic. We definitely have some interesting stories on that too, and customers and suppliers that kind of things that happen when you don't do that due diligence. But as Tom was saying, so we want to talk a little bit about data here, right? Because as we know, the more you know about the business you want to do business with, it makes it easier for your processes, your decisions, and those strategic kind of buckets that Tom mentioned. But there is some information gaps there. That there's lack of information out there on, and specifically on small businesses. And here again, I like to share some numbers and statistics that are out there that we've gathered here. If you look at small business specifically, like it takes 5 years before a small business builds a credit profile, and only under half of them have a credit history of these small businesses. And really kind of crucial when you talk about a small business, and we'll talk a bit more about all of the influence there on the individuals, but most of the small businesses mix business and personal operations. or even this one here, I like it. It's very crucial. 1 in 3 of the authorized reps have a derogatory event on file. And again, if you think about how important the individual, the owner, the executive is to a small business, that's a tremendous impact there. So just again, small businesses, they're very diverse. We know that, so that there's a lot of differences there and a lot to learn about these types of small businesses. And the data is very challenging. Business data obviously is a lot more complicated than kind of data on us, on individuals, on consumers. And here again, the point I was making earlier that the business really is the person behind it. The owner, the founder. When we talk about really small businesses, truly small businesses, the impact on the person, on the business is tremendous. So the data gap here, right? So as we know, we need data to help us make decisions, and it's really crucial for you, the customer, to have data outside of the traditional public sources as well. So because that opens up opportunities where you can target new prospects, new suppliers, new vendors, new partners that come into your organization, really kind of untapped market, and that helps you manage and mitigate that risk. So what we call it data footprints. A lot of these small businesses leave data footprints, and in addition to the standard public, traditional standard sources that you see listed here, there's also additional information out there that's crucial: trade payment data, financial payment data, and then alternative data. And that really plays an important role for us and for our data gathering. So alternative data, when I mention that, we're talking about data such as mobile, landline, phone bills, utility bills, other payment history sources that provide the insight and on the business and the people behind this. And that again really helps you assess, find out more information on the business and assess risk. So another slide here, what the point I was making earlier really is people behind these businesses leave additional footprints, data footprints again, we call them. A lot of transaction points that we can see listed here. So this information really helps you with, remember the questions we had earlier: is this small business real? How many sources do I have behind it? How much information do I have? Is this small business stable? So yes, if it's real, is it actually stable? What information do I have there? And then is it reputable, or what do I need to know about the business and the reputation, or how could it harm my business doing business with this company? Tom, I wanted to just kind of reach out again and just say anything that sticks out on this slide here for you, anything you wanted to comment on this type of data, the sources that we have, maybe alternative data.
Yeah, I think that these types of sources certainly do, when combined with the information that we have on the business entity, oftentimes will lead to some pretty useful and powerful insights, particularly if we're dealing with smaller businesses where there may not be very much information available on the commercial entity. But even when we can see things like, okay, we are now dealing with a business, if it's a small business, where the owner of that business owns property versus another business where an owner doesn't own property. That kind of speaks to at least some measure of stability in terms of that individual or the individuals running that company. You mentioned earlier about a third of the people that are connected with businesses will have some form of derogatory information about them. It's just kind of an interesting story. I was with a client who was evaluating small businesses, and one of the conversations that we had was that she had noticed that there's quite a few people that are connected with small businesses, which is mostly who she works with. She noticed that there are quite a few people that have criminal histories. And her comment about that was, well, yeah, of course. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who maybe, got into some trouble at one point in their life and had some criminal convictions, and now that makes it really hard for them to go get a job, so they're going to start their own business now. So it's not unusual that we would see more of those with small business owners. But you know what, Etta, there was a question here from one of our attendees that said, as all these parameters yield a subjective output, how can we measure or convert these into numerical values? And that's something that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, but because as we go through all of these assessments, there are different scoring values that we apply to these businesses, and we also have the ability to even build custom scores for analytic or probabilistic scores for our clients. We do that as well, so we'll do customized scoring for them.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for bringing up that question. I was going to mention it too. So keep on asking questions, and then so I'll go through my few more slides here, and then yes, Tom will go into more detail here. So for us, really, so yes, a lot of data, and again, we'll talk more in detail about it. But then the power really is aggregating this data from these thousands of sources, right? That's what we help you. We built the broadest, foundation. And resolving that data really with our specific linking technology, resolving that into that information on that specific entity, right? That's what you need, the precise view on the entity on that small business. So again, specific technologies and linking and our information that we have that leads to that, help you with that information. So again, I'll go bit quicker through my next slide. So we here at LexisNexis, so what do we do best? And just to kind of summarize what I kind of talked about, the vast data resources that we have, bringing those all together, the big data technology behind that with the advanced linking, right? That's obviously crucial to help you with connecting, doing the entity resolution, and also connecting to business, the business to the individual or individuals. Analytic insights, so that's very crucial for us. The modeling we do here, that we help with kind of bringing analytics to all that data and helping you analyze and bring back the data to you. The industry expertise, obviously very specific there for some of your industries, and then customer focused products that we can help work, as I was saying, analytic models, that type of thing we can do for you. So to summarize here, we bridge the information gap with this information that I was talking about, technology, data, linking, expertise. So this slide, Tom will talk more in detail, but so this all leads kind of into the product portfolios or different products and solutions that we have, whether it is focused on the due diligence, whether that's your biggest issue, or is it the credit risk information there, or kind of the supplier risk specific. Okay, so Tom, let's talk a bit more about the tools and solutions then.
All right, very good. Thanks, Etta. Okay, so as we look through the different sort of stages that we go through with the different vendors that we work with, as we talked about earlier, there's this, maybe a relatively easy or frictionless kind of environment where, all we're doing is some basic identity verification, some watch list screening, those kinds of things on the front end. We certainly have the tools to do that kind of work. as we go deeper into due diligence and then to monitor and to help comply with regulations, we have tools that will do all of that. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few of them. This isn't meant to be exhaustive. We sort of meant for this to highlight a few things and maybe prompt some further discussions. But we didn't want this to be too much of a selling pitch or anything like that, but just to kind of give you a sense for what we can offer. So on the alternative data side, so as Etta mentioned, there's all this data. There's over 10,000 sources and that kind of thing. What we've done is we've built those sources into a number of different products that would help with evaluating the stability of a business. So either that's looking at it from a financial perspective, from a creditworthiness perspective. How do these vendors' creditors sort of see them? Are they going to have problems getting access to capital and those kinds of questions? Or, can we establish a correlation between the credit performance and the performance overall as a business? We worked recently with a client who sold their products and materials and services through a dealer network, and one of the things that they noticed that correlated with that dealer network was some of these credit scores and attributes that we were just talking about, right? So the performance of this dealer network and the performance of ultimately the customers that dealer network brings to our client were directly correlated to some of these credit tools. So while those credit tools are built to assess a risk around lending primarily, there are correlations that do exist across use cases. And so one of those use cases that we've seen over and over again is, how are we going to have difficulty with them as a vendor? Are they going to perform well? Are they going to perform on time? Are they going to do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it? There's definitely a correlation between those scores and that level of assessment. The other thing with the risk attributes in particular that we can talk about is this notion of beginning to look at different score development and scorecards that we can potentially build and then monitor. So we can use our credit scores that have been already developed, but we can build different models based on different performance metrics that we're trying to evaluate. So the credit score will look at whether a business is going to go 90 days beyond terms, but it also looks at business failure with or without a bankruptcy. So that's kind of baked into the credit score, but we could also look at just satisfaction, overall performance. Are there particular pieces of data that would help us understand whether or not this is a business that's going to perform well, right? So there's some due diligence that's kind of wrapped into that. The next tool that I mentioned was a tool called Business Instant ID, which is a business verification tool. It essentially asks, is this a real business? It can look at up to 5 people. So if you have business owners or if you have individuals that are coming forward associated with the business, it can verify their identity and also establish whether or not there's any connection or link between the people and the business. So just a low friction, low cost screening tool. Included in that is some basic watch list screening and politically exposed people screening. So that can be part of it as well. So we can sort of look at this verification of this business and sort of streamline a whole bunch of those processes. rather than going out to Secretary of State and doing all these other searches, it can be all integrated into one easy sort of passive data. What we've already done is we've already gone out to all of those, again, about 10,000 sources. So if they have anything to say about this business or these people, that'll be presented back within these within the results of this particular search. Okay, so in terms of maybe we need to take a deeper dive at this point, right? Maybe we need to go a little bit deeper to understand, who maybe the people aren't identified that are connected to a business. Maybe we need to understand who those people are and identify those and dig into those folks a little more quickly. So we have some abilities there in terms of just an online portal where our clients go to perform these due diligence searches every day. And there are comprehensive reports that are available, deep background reports on businesses as well as individuals that are not credit reports, so they don't require the person's permission or any of that compliance regulation that sometimes surrounds a credit report on a person in particular. So when we think about those reports, as we sort of dig into those reports a little bit, any derogatory public record that's available on the business or the person, all of their history of addresses, telephone numbers, tax ID numbers, line of business, what do they do, associated people, and not just a name and a title, but very often we'd be able to say, okay, it's not just that Tom Hunt is the name of the person who owns this business, but we know exactly which Tom Hunt we're talking about, and we can bring you to information about that person as well. So in some cases, and this is often the case, we have clients that are, and rightly so, right, in this environment, right, ambivalent about asking for personally identifiable information about an individual associated with the business. Well, we start with the business, and we can oftentimes back into, here are the associated people, and here is the background search on those individuals as well, right? So we're looking at it from a really holistic view when we get to that point where we're looking at all of that kind of information on the business and the person. I wanted to talk a minute about scoring in general and sort of give you a little bit of a case history of something that we did when we started working with credit information on small businesses about a decade or so ago. Started really looking closely at credit information on businesses. And one of the first things that we found out was very often the credit information there isn't very much history that's available in terms of actual credit performance. So how do they pay their bills? Do they pay their bills on time? When we go to the classic sources to get that kind of information, very often with small businesses, there just isn't much. There might not be any. Etta sort of alluded to this earlier. If it's a business that's less than maybe a few years old, it just hasn't established a credit profile yet. But even if it has, many small businesses just don't seek credit in the name of the business. It's all connected to the business owner. And so from a credit standpoint, what we began to do was to look at that gap in the market and begin to research, are there attributes that are not credit performance attributes? How did they pay a particular obligation? But do we have data within our profile on these businesses that would be predictive of credit performance that really, when you look at it at first glance, doesn't seem to have anything to do with credit, right? So, for example, if a business has an active Secretary of State registration or has never let their Secretary of State registration go inactive, then that business is half the credit risk of one that has, right? So we see that correlation. we see that they're 3 times as likely to default if there's been a judgment filed within the last 2 years, and 4 times if there's multiple judgments within the last 2 years. And then we begin to look at the information with the associated people. So, they're twice as likely to default if an associate has had a judgment or lien filed in the last 7 years. And when I say associate, I mean someone who's leading the company, who's a manager or an executive or an owner of the company. If that associate or that authorized representative has a criminal history, then they're 3 times as likely to default. So this is all around a credit use case, but this is an example of the kind of research that we do on small businesses and correlated data between trying to measure for and look for an outcome that we're trying to understand better. So this is, again, what we did in a credit context. So we built scores. We built, in this case, credit scores. We can build other types of scores that might evaluate vendors, that might evaluate other types of risk. But this is a credit use case. We certainly have other examples or capacities that we could potentially look at. But one of the things that we noticed right away when we built the credit scores is that the blended scores that have both the business and the person information associated and being drawn into that scoring process, those scores tend to perform a little better than just the business ones by themselves. And so, the thought is that the more information that the scoring process has to work with, and we see this with fraud scores, we see this with credit scores, and we see it with other types of scores that we've built, generally speaking, and I think it's probably fairly intuitive. The more information that we can bring to the score, the better off we're going to be in terms of how useful and predictive that score would actually be. All right. So Etta, I'm going to sort of pass it back to you. That was just meant to highlight a few of the things. That wasn't meant to be exhaustive. If you have questions about data that you think we could be helpful with, we'd love to talk to you about that. But those were just a few ideas of things that we can do to help support some of the initiatives that we talked about earlier in the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And as you can tell, we have lots of stories and we have lots of data and statistics. And so absolutely, as Tom said, please reach out to us. We'd love to share more with you, and we're coming to the end here for the presentation. But I hope we answered the one question we had. There's still time for a question or two. So if there's anything else we can answer while we're on here, definitely please go ahead and type that into the Q&A box there. But really just a summary, right? So we talked about the challenges, the risk, know your business, know your partners, know who you are dealing with. And for us, this is crucial to help you with that. And we developed the most concise profile of a business entity and the people that are around the business as well. And we have different products and solutions as we alluded to for your specific segment needs as well. We talked about data strategies and our strengths and differentiation. Again, would love to talk to you more about that as well and have lots more statistics on that. We have specific customer solutions, so definitely that's something that we would like to talk to you about if that's the need within your organization. So that's, we want to learn more about you, your pain points, what keeps you up at night, and we definitely want to talk to you more about that. So waiting for questions. So if you have some more questions, I think we have one more that's coming in here. But while we're doing that, I bring up a poll question, or we really wanted to see. We would love to contact you. So the next slide we'll bring up a poll question, and really just let us know how and when we can best contact you. But so Tom, I think we got time for one more quick question here. And we both talked about, I talked about linking, matching the business entity and people around it. But there's one interesting question that came in here is, so how do I know, or how do you know that it's the right business? I know that's a long answer, but if you can narrow it down a bit, right? Because we could go into a lot of details on that one. But yeah, how do you know it's the right business?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, the searching part of it for us is input dependent, and we try to make our due diligence tools very flexible so that you can cast as wide or as narrow of a net as you'd like to cast if you're doing that kind of research. So for example, maybe you want to do a search on a particular location. Maybe you feel like you've dealt with these people before, something about this seems familiar. You could go into our tools and you could run a search on just an address, and we'd tell you all the businesses that we have at that address, or phone number, or tax ID, or any combination of those things. Most of the time we encourage our clients to give us as much input as they can possibly gather. So if it's on a business, we'd love to see a complete business name, a full address, phone number, tax ID, first and last name of the person who owns the business or is an executive of the business. All of that will help us to narrow down, is this the right business that you're looking for? But it's a smart question, because the person who wrote the question, maybe like to have a sense for all of the variation that's within the data that we work with every day. I've mentioned it a few times, about 10,000 sources on an average day, about 200 million updates to those sources. And if on the business level, if we created a unique record for every business that has unique information, we would have over 300 million businesses in our database. I think most people understand there's probably about somewhere between 25 and 30 million businesses out there. And so what that sort of speaks to is that within the data, there is a lot of variation. From the utility sources, the business name might be one thing versus the Secretary of State and another, and then a UCC filing or some other public record has another variation on the name, and then we might have addresses that are the business owner's address, and 2 or 3 or 4 more operational addresses. And so what we really do to look at all of that is to say, as we look at all of that data that's coming in, what we're looking for is commonality within the actual data. And there's a whole bunch of variables that we look at, but at the end of the day, if the name is slightly different but the tax ID and the phone number and the address are the same, the question then becomes, what's the probability that that's a different company? Well, in that case, it's pretty low, because we have all of these. We do have a different name, but we have a common set of other attributes that we look at. And so that's generally how we do it, is we look at all of the data that we have on the business or the person, and we fundamentally say, okay, how much of this is aligned, and then also how unique is it? And given those two variables, there's sort of a process that we use to then determine whether or not a piece of information belongs. So yeah, I hope that helps in terms of how we sort of match all of that up.
Hope so too, yeah. And I know it's hard to put that in a short answer. There's a lot of information there, obviously, but thank you, Tom. Okay, so we're ready to wrap this up. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation. I hope we shared some good information and something valuable that helps you sleep better, I hope. And yeah, we're ready to wrap up there.
Well, we're now coming up on our 45 minutes past the hour and want to be respectful of your time. So we are pleased that you were able to attend today's webinar and hope that you found it valuable. If we didn't have time for your questions, Etta or Tom will follow up directly with you so that you get your answer. The presentation and webinar recording will be distributed to all registrants. Again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.